telling about the Adirondacks.
Thank you. Does this thing work? Good, because I don't hear very well. Okay, you want to know about the Adirondacks. How many of you have visited them? That's good to know. We need all the visitors we can get. All right, now how many people were in World War II? All right, so I will tell you first about World War II. It's time you learned. First of all, I need to tell you that the Adirondack State Park is the biggest state park in the United States. It is about 6 million acres, and it covers parts of 10 counties. I'm from Essex County, and that's entirely inside the park, and Kent is from Hamilton County, which is also entirely in the park.
I'm from Warren County, which is entirely in the park.
What?
I'm from Warren County, which is entirely in the park.
Except for Glens Falls.
Ah, that's right.
Lake George was added in the 60s.
Just before you get to Lake George, there's a sign that you're entering the park. Good try. Everything in Glens Falls says it's Adirondack. It's nice, it's easy to get confused. But yeah, it's a big park. And the population is about 150,000, which is, for New York City, that would be maybe 2 blocks. And I am only going to tell you a part that I know about, which is southern Adirondacks. Of course, I used to, whenever I went anywhere, they would ask me where I was from, and I would say New York, and they'd say, "Oh, you poor thing with all those buildings." And I would say, "No, upstate New York." And they'd say, "Oh, Albany, Schenectady, Rochester." And I'd say, "No, farther north." And then they would go blank. Well, I told them, "Well, maybe you've heard of Lake George." "Oh," or maybe Lake Placid. "Ah." And as far as they know, that's all there is to it. So I live in a place called Olmstedville. Anybody hear of Olmstedville? Before that, I was in Scroon Lake. And before that, where were we? Chestertown. Good, I'm glad we have a good following here. But I am not a native Adirondacker. So I wrote these 2 books about it because I found it kind of fascinating. I got over it later. But I was out in Seattle. I was born and raised out there, and it's World War II, and I'm working at Boeing, drawing pictures to show Rosie where to put the rivets. And the Navy sent a trainload of gunner's mates from the East Coast to the West Coast because the war was winding down in Europe. This was 1944. And this sailor got off the train in Seattle, and I met him that night, and he never got away. So he wanted to bring me to God's country. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I thought maybe, he said he was in the mountains in New York State, and the only mountains I could think of was Ichabod Crane. I had the wrong mountains. And so in 1945, I went down to San Francisco and married this fellow. The Navy sent him back to the wrong port. And we came back here and got off the train in Albany and started north and kept going. And I'm looking for mountains because I'm from where there's mountains, you know? And the Adirondacks are just hills. But now that I've been here for 70 years, they've gotten taller. So, what was I going to say, Kent? Oh, by the way, this is number 3 son, Kent. He's probably old enough to be an ALL, right?
Yeah.
There's number 1 son back there. His name's Eric. And I think you are old enough to be.
Oh, yeah, I invented.
And this is their friend from California who's taking these pictures. Is that what you call it?
One after another video.
Isn't it? His name's Pete. He's a good guy. So, what shall I start with? Oh, how about this? I brought my book to read because I forget everything. So I'm going to read you one chapter, and then you can listen to somebody that knows more than I do. Okay, it's October 1948. There I was, at the ripe old age of 22, living in an old army tent beside a brook about a mile out from a little town in the Adirondacks. That was Chestertown. I was already a veteran of 3 years of married life with a 2-year-old daughter. We were building a house up on the hill, and the tent was only temporary. I have found that temporary is a term used a lot in the Adirondacks. It's something of a permanent condition. The weather was really warm in June when we put up that tent, so we located near the brook in the shade. The only thing wrong with that was that now it was October and cold, and the roof was not on the house yet. I couldn't wait to get to the general store with my 2-year-old on cold mornings and thaw out with their hot chocolate and real toast. We were new to this community. New can be a long time in the Adirondacks. And we were not very well acquainted yet. Down the road in one direction was a large farm. Chickens, cows, corn, pastures. A very nice farm. Up the road in the other direction lived a large Adirondack family whose matriarch had taken me under her wing. This woman knew everything I needed to learn. You see, I lost my place already. She cooked up veritable blizzards of heavenly food on her big wood stove. By this time, we had only acquired about 40 chickens. No, not chickens, rabbits. When we decided to butcher a large batch of rabbits, she showed me how to can the meat. Rabbit is really quite tasty, a lot like chicken. We had lots of rabbits, and it was definitely time to thin them out. We butchered 20 or 40 of them. It's hard to remember how many. Besides, there were 12 or 14 goats to look after, not to mention the flock of racing pigeons that was left over at Scroon Manor from when they were having these large congregations there. 9 puppies that the dog gave birth to under the floor of the tent, and 3 kittens that the cat had on a basket of clean laundry. Oh yes, and the 3 Cochin Bantam chickens we had brought back from the Rutland Fair. Henry, Henrietta 1, and Henrietta 2. So then the other nice lady who lived across the road decided to ask me to join the Rebeccas. I was thrilled. I had no idea what the Rebeccas were, but I could hardly wait to find out. What I discovered was they were the counterpart of the Oddfellows. Any Oddfellows here? I think it's out of style. Let's see, one of the benevolent organizations that added some welcome social life to the long winter months. They did turn out to be very nice ladies, and at the first meeting I attended, they were planning a covered dish supper. I soon discovered that at a covered dish supper, you are expected to bring a dish to pass. I was inspired. I went home to my tent and consulted The Joy of Cooking, which was the book my mother gave me when I got married. I was still learning to cook, and it was an uphill battle on a 2-burner stove just outside the tent in a little shelter. And we did, however, have a little stove top oven, which doubled nicely as an extra seat when we had company. Our budget did not include any gourmet touches, but fortune was smiling upon me. There was a recipe in there for chicken pot pie. I figured with just a few substitutions I could produce a large bowl of it. Remember, rabbit tastes a lot like chicken. We had lots of rabbit. I got out my large yellow Pyrex bowl, the really big one, and a few cans of mushroom soup, and produced a really tasty pot pie with a lovely biscuit topping. Well, that pot pie made a big hit. The only thing was, I noticed as the meal progressed that everybody was requesting another helping of that chicken pie. It occurred to me that I was sailing under false colors. I have always prided myself on being truthful, so finally I found it necessary to mention that it was really a rabbit pie. The effect was startling. Everything seemed to stop kind of in midair. The lady from the nice farm down the road turned to me, and I noticed that her face was a rather pale green. She looked at me accusingly and said, "I bet you made the crust with goat milk too, didn't you?" Well, of course. It had not occurred to me that rabbit and goat milk were not considered proper food by this lady. Chicken was the proper meat. Also, one did not use goat milk. That's what cows were for. If you ever want to be a legend in your own time, this is the way to go about it. The good ladies of the Rebeccas stood by me in spite of my many shortcomings. They tried really hard to straighten me out, and now and then had some success. Over time, though, it became apparent that some things are beyond help. One can only remain tolerant, and they did. I still remember fondly the lovely shower they gave me when we had our 5th child. That 5th child is now way over 40 years old. The other day I had lunch with a lady who used to live across the road from me. She said, "Do you remember when you made that rabbit pie?" I really enjoy being a legend. Now I'm going to give you my number 3 son, Kent. Oh, by the way, oh, I did, yes. See?
Well, hello. Mother's been helping me edit my writings, and this one is labeled okay. She wanted me to read this. It's about Adirondack-ishness and that sort of thing. It's called Chasing the Elusive Buck, an Adirondack Hunting Tale. In my mother's book, Leaky Boots, there's a chapter called Adirondack Economics, which tells of the constant quest for economic stability in the mountains in the 1940s and 50s. Every now and then I used to read about the post-war prosperity, she writes. I used to sit on the porch steps and wonder when all that prosperity would get to the Adirondacks. It never happened. Now, some 6 or 7 decades hence, I can give you an update on Adirondack economics, though it hardly seems worthwhile since there is so little change to report. In my own life, for instance, it went like this. Early on, in a display of courage, especially considering the results, our parents exposed us to tools. We did learn to make our own toys, though, and eventually learned to repair some of the many things we broke. In 1969, our family acquired 100 acres of logging woods and a barn in Scroon Lake. A year later, in 1970, we opened Above and Beyond Campground there. Building a campground as a family taught us many things. It was to be a full-service campground in the national park style. We added more each year, ending up with 85 campsites. Not only that, but at the same time, 3 of us brothers managed to graduate high school. And while in high school in the 70s, in the midst of the rock and roll revolution, my brothers and I scrounged up a $500 PA system and a couple of used guitars to play dances in bars for $200 or $300 a gig. 20 years of inflation later, I got together with some friends and put about $100,000 worth of equipment in the truck, and we did full-on productions with light and sound for, again, $200 or $300 a night. Seeking my fortune as a musician was truly educational, though financially disastrous. Stonemasonry taught me that you don't get rich working for the wealthy. And we did work for the wealthy. After all, who is going to buy a $100,000 fireplace? This, by the way, is so much work and overhead that a mistake on your bid could sink you. In the 2nd and 3rd decades as a master mason, your proficiency in stonework brings you the fancier jobs, but it's still hard labor on the rock pile. Snow farming is fun. I did it for as long as I could afford to. In the mid-1980s, I was operating a $250,000 grooming machine and occasionally approaching its limits at Gore Mountain ski area. It paid minimum wage, plus 25 cents an hour for working the ungodly hours of the night, high on a mountaintop, often in below zero weather. One night, a battery cable came loose, completely disabling the groomer, and I was instantly stranded at the peak in the dark. I carried extra clothing and a flashlight and lots of matches. Since I also had a walkie-talkie, I didn't need to start a fire and got a ride and another groomer to finish up the night with. There are many billionaires' playgrounds in these mountains. Eric's pretty familiar with that. Caretaking one remote area at the beginning of the Hudson River showed me what was going on at the other end of the Hudson River. These captains of industry and finance would come up and party all weekend long when the stock market went way up. When the stock market went way down, they'd come up and party all weekend long because they make their money on the trades. Buy or sell, they win. As a conductor, I learned a lot about railroading and politics. I was a head conductor, among many other things, on the Upper Hudson River Railroad on track owned by Warren County and the town of Corinth. It's a beautiful stretch of the Hudson River, only available by rail. You'd think the railroad could make money on it. We employees proved it could be done, but it was a lot of work, sort of a non-starter for the political types. We called ourselves the friendliest railroad and had a good time of it while it lasted for 12 years, but we could not find a suitable owner for the business. It needs entertainment management. But the county looks for railroad companies to run it, and it keeps failing. Now, the search for a decent ale led me to a steady job outside the Adirondack Park. At the turn of the millennium, microbreweries started to appear nearby. Cooper's Cave Ale Company is a family business started by the Bethels, Ed and his wife Patty and their son Adrian. The three of them figured they could handle it by themselves when they hired me temporarily. 19 years later, they've got 40 employees. But when I retire, they say it'll be time to sell the business because I've become such an integral part of it. I've had various other jobs, including but not limited to pizza cook, amusement park promoter, amusement park ride operator, trailer hauler, hot tub and pool technician, landscaper, electrician, rustic furnishings maker, log cabin builder, plumber, bulldozer operator, and of course carpenter, but around these mountains, who hasn't been a carpenter at one time or another? Superhighways have come, television and eventually radio signals have come to the mountains. Cell phone service is creeping in, and the internet is making inroads. You can buy broadband service almost everywhere in the Adirondacks, though very, very few places in these mountains actually have what could be barely called high-speed access. You can pay for it, but you can't have it. I figure that by the time we get all wired up for high-speed internet up there, everybody else will be totally wireless. So the Adirondack economy is in bad shape still, and living there is difficult. Not perhaps such a bad thing, I guess, since, as they say, if it were easy, everybody would be doing it. And that would really tick us off. Besides, economics are abstract. Life is not. I'll take the economic hit to live in the mountains and have a life that is not based so much on the abstract and virtual existence. I have made my escape to the trees, the streams, and the land I love. To me, that's reality.
Oh, I have to explain to you, ever since I got a bad hip, I've got a cane. And Eric, what kind of wood did you use to make my cane?
Maple,
Maple?
maybe ash, probably maple.
He gave me my first cane. And then my son-in-law found a nice piece of a nice long stick at the bottom of the trail to Giant Mountain. And when I needed a cane, he fixed me one out of that stick. And whoops, there's the other one. Thank you. And, oh yeah, I was asking Barry, number two son, what kind of wood this was, you know? It had a nice handle at the top. He said, oh, that was a beech sapling, and where the handle is where the root started. Nifty. So number three son decided that I needed something a little stronger, shall I say?
Stronger and lighter.
And lighter, that's true. So he made me one out of apple. You want to tell him about it?
Oh, well, it's just that we have an apple tree in the yard. We were pruning it to make it short enough so that we could reach the apples. And this branch branched off at just about 90 degrees and seemed to lend itself to a cane, so
Works good.
it was pretty simple, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Hang on to that for me. I keep dropping everything. So, I do have a very handy family. This fellow is a Finnish carpenter that can do gorgeous work. And four of you, I think it was, that were stonemasons, is that right?
At one point, yeah.
And, oh, let's see. What was I going to say? You don't know either. Oh, yeah, Christmas. My father-in-law, he wasn't from the Adirondacks either. He came up here from Long Island. My mother never got used to that. She thought it was a strange brogue. And he had 300 acres up here where he used to come hunting all the time. He had a nursery store on Long Island. It'd be a big one, you know. And about 1939, he got tangled up with the mafia, so he thought it was time to leave town, and so he moved up here. My husband spent his last year of high school in Pottersville, transferred up here from Jamaica High School, class of, I think it was 200, graduated in a class of 11. Said it was the best year he ever had. Of course, he was new in town and there were lots of girls. So what was, oh yes, Christmas, yes. Well, they came up here and there was lots of balsam. Now, I came from the West. I had never heard of balsam. I thought it was like the wood that my brothers used to use to make model airplanes. No way. Turns out it's the Christmas tree of the Northeast. And there was lots of it up here, so we would cut a lot of balsam every year and take it down to Long Island and sell it all. And then he decided we would make wreaths. Well, we made wreaths. We made them by the 1,000 and wholesaled them down there. So every October, our house smelled exactly like balsam, which is a nice, not a bad smell. And I made beautiful wreaths. It only took me 2 years to learn how. And so that's the way we did Christmas. Oh, let's see if I can remember. Ah, yes.
Tell about the wreaths Tell about the wreaths that smelled.
The what? Oh, the tree?
No, the wreaths, the evergreens that we gathered that smelled bad.
That was the tree. And I was about to tell him. Ah, yeah. My husband and his father got together and went to Canada and bought a lot of Christmas trees and took them down to Long Island where they wholesaled them. So they went up there to Nova Scotia to cut trees, and I found it amazing that they were cutting these trees in October, for heaven's sakes. But I didn't dwell on it. I was home with the 2-year-old and feeling sorry for myself. So they got home just in time to go hunting. Hunting is very important if you're in the Adirondacks. It's the best thing you can possibly do. My husband was a hunter. And he also did a lot of guiding of hunters, and he made quite a good living at it for a few years. Anyway, so they came back in time to go hunting, and then we made thousands of wreaths out of good Adirondack balsam fir. Those wreaths were loaded on the truck and went with them to Long Island, where they sold everything. I was left at home again with the baby and no Christmas tree. It was clearly time for me to pull myself together and become self-sufficient. On Christmas Eve, I ventured out into the woods and cut a nice shapely tree. Brought it in, propped it up, and decorated it. I felt very accomplished. On Christmas Day, my husband arrived back in town on the bus. I cranked up the Model A, yes, really, and drove in town to bring him home. As soon as we came in the door, his nose wrinkled, and he asked, "What is that awful odor? It smells like a cat." At that point, we didn't have any cats. Finally, he noticed my lovely Christmas tree. "Good Lord," he says, "you got a cat spruce." Well, I had never heard of cat spruce. I had sort of wondered what that odor was. We didn't have that tree very long. Also, Greg never went off to Canada and Long Island again to be a Christmas tree merchant. It was no fun, it didn't pay very well, and who knew what he'd be coming home to? So I go on about the wreath season and how all the boys had to go out and get all that balsam. We made wreaths by the ton. We used balsam by the ton, and they had to carry it all. So I had a housekeeper to look after the house while I was busy with all these wreaths, you know. I had her once a week, and boy, the house smelled just like ammonia for a long time. And it was lovely. Okay. One year at the end of wreath season, we said goodbye to Jenny again, and she presented me with a new sponge mop, advising me to use it frequently. That Christmas, my mother's present to me was the service of a housekeeper once a week for a whole year. I called Jenny right away to tell her about that. She said, if I'd known that was going to happen, I'd have given you a better mop. For a whole year, we were nice and clean. Of course, the boys learned all about Christmas trees. And when I moved to Scroon Lake, I should say when we moved to Scroon Lake, we moved into a big barn. You had to have a big Christmas tree in a big barn. 17 feet. You had to climb up in the balcony to put the bells on the top, you know? Well, I loved those. We had lots of interesting experiences with that. And the taking down the tree party became a large social event. culminating in a blazing inferno in the fireplace. When I wrote this, I was still making wreaths. It says, "These days I go and make wreaths for a florist I know who appreciates the handwork. It keeps me out of trouble for the entire month of November. I go through 4 or 5 pair of gloves and about that many tons of balsam, and we have a wonderful time. I notice that I'm slowing down a bit, though, and this year my work shirt sort of fell apart. Gee, it was only about 20 years old. So I told my employer that maybe it's time for me to retire. She bought me a new shirt." As for Christmas tree, I usually get a tiny one for the tiny house where I live now, but that's okay because I'm not there very much. I'm off seeing what they're using in each of my children's homes. They are all real Christmas tree connoisseurs. There was something I was going to say, but I've forgotten that too. And the reason I was driving a Model A Ford was because it's after the war, and I think what we had then was a 36 Ford that my husband had used to court a local girl, but she decided she wasn't going to live in the Adirondacks, and she went elsewhere. So I got him. So here we were with this 36 Ford, and you had to have a pail of water with you for the leaky radiator and stuff like that, you know. So he finally got this Model A. He bought it in Lake George for $50. And we ran that thing quite a while, and that's what I learned to drive in, because in Seattle you didn't have to drive. There was a bus for everywhere. So okay, so it was time to learn to drive. Also, the nice thing about a Model A is you can usually fix it with a hairpin or some duct tape. And besides that, you can't go fast enough to get in much trouble. There was the time that the steering went when I was turning into what was her name? To my aunt's driveway and ran over her petunias. But, you know, it wasn't going very fast. Our 2-year-old daughter usually accompanied me. She would stand in front of the passenger seat and hold on to the dashboard. That way she could see where we were going. It was also the only way she could brace herself for the rattly car and the bumpy road. Lots of dirt roads up there. Of course, they're paved now, but they got a lot of potholes. This was before seat belts, but seat belts were no problem in that car. One day, the neighbor's son, who was helping with our work with the goats and things, was riding with me into town. He decided to have a little fun. While I was shopping, he tied the gear shift to the brake pedal. Suddenly, the car became very hard to manage. I went barreling up the main street of town, trying to keep out of the way of things while he howled with laughter. Greg suddenly got a lot of calls from people reporting that his wife was speeding through town. I should mention that the speed limit was a lot less then than it is now. Besides, how fast can a Model A go? After about 2 years of driving around, it occurred to us that someday somebody might want to see my driver's license. So I better get one. It didn't look as though the Model A would pass inspection, so we borrowed his father's Hudson pickup truck. Well, you know how big a Model A is. This truck was 3 times. Oh, let's see. I drove gingerly through Warrensburg and Lake George and parked at the curb in Glens Falls. A grumpy old man climbed in to give me my test. I have poor hearing. I don't know if you noticed it yet, but I have poor hearing. After turning the key, my first mistake was to ask, "Is the motor running?" You didn't have to ask with a Model A. I could tell by his expression that it was, so I flapped my hand out the window and started out. In 1948, there were no turn indicators. You had to use hand signals. We got into an argument about whether or not I had hand signaled before I left the curb, and I hadn't even gone around the block yet. Then he had me do a K-turn in a driveway. I ran that big truck over both curbs. By the time we returned, he was so disgusted he climbed out and disappeared. I told Greg it was no use, and we drove home under our little black cloud. 3 days later, my license came in the mail. I guess he never wanted to go through that again. We had some good times in that car. We drove it up on top of the sawdust pile in back of our house, and a lot of cross-country stuff, too. One evening, we were driving down Route 9 when a shiny new Buick passed us. Greg became incensed. He said he didn't like the superior attitude of that Buick. We speeded up and passed that car with the throttle wide open and the roof banging indignantly. After that incident, our little car was never quite the same. The little motor had just given its all. We put it out to pasture behind the sawdust pile where the daisies could grow right up through the floorboards, and we acquired a green 39 pickup truck. That truck was big enough to carry loads of rabbit chow and take the goats to shows. We had some lovely goats. It was a good thing we lived on a hill, because usually the way you started it was to head down the hill working all the gadgets. Most of the time it started by the time you got to the bottom. After that, there was a blue Plymouth sedan, and then there were dozens of station wagons. The bigger our family got, the bigger the car. But that's a whole other story.
Oh, let's see, we were talking about doing things about snow. It seems like a good year to do things about snow. Yeah. And and while I was working as a groomer at Gore Mountain Ski Area, I had a visit from a good friend I'd met at college, Pete Plumley. Pete had been working in film and video and media in generally, and called about doing a shoot, still photography of the work of grooming ski trails. That winter, I was working the graveyard shift from midnight till 9 in the morning. Grooming usually takes place at night when it's colder and the grooming is more effective. Often, if the temperatures are hovering around freezing, the groomers will wait till it gets colder, or go home if it's too warm. Pete knew my working hours and wanted to get photos of the sunrise at the top of the mountain. I got permission from mountain management to take him up to the summit with a Hydromaster grooming machine. On the appointed day, Pete drove up from New York City where he was working, and we met at the base area by the lodge at 4 o'clock in the morning. Pete had chosen the date well. It was to be a clear night for a glorious sunrise. As you may know, clear nights in the winter tend to be colder as the Earth's heat radiates skyward. When I met up with Pete, it was well below zero at the base area. Inside the cab of my Hydromaster, it was toasty warm. I climbed out of the cab onto the 5-foot wide track on the left side of the machine and helped Pete up onto the track. And then I climbed back into the cab and indicated the small seat to my left for him to ride on. Pete, though, had noticed that this huge groomer, 12 feet wide and over 25 feet long, had what looked like the tiniest little pickup cargo bed behind the cab. He wanted to ride up the hill on that little cargo bed so that he didn't have to take pictures through the windows. I pointed out that it was dark. He pointed out that I had big lights, 4 million candle power. And I reminded him that where we were going on top of the mountain, it was 1,000 feet higher and it would be much colder. And he insisted that he would ride in the back and he'd be okay. Yeah. I stopped once or twice on the way up to make sure he was indeed okay. He said he was, and when we got to the peak, he got out and took some photos of the groomer while I was working the ski lift ramps, replacing the snow that the skiers had pushed off the ramp during the day and smoothing out the surface. All those lights on the groomer gave his images interesting light and shadow as I smoothed the ramps. And you can see some of those. And the air was really crisp. Oh, and did I mention that it was cold? This was in the 1980s, and Pete had a very good 35 millimeter camera for his work that night, but it was cold, real cold. The photos he managed to save looked pretty nice. The camera worked fine. The film did not. As it had traveled from New York City at sea level and more reasonable temperatures to Gore Mountain at about 3,000 feet above sea level and far below zero, whatever moisture was in that roll of film froze between the layers of film and caused it to rip apart. The last picture exposed on that roll was taken at the peak. The sunrise was beautiful, and Pete snapped the shutter a lot of times before he noticed that he'd taken more shots than the film had available. The broken film was not advancing, and he had missed his sunrise photo op. Well, we found a dark place for him to fix his camera and install another roll of film. And Pete found someone who could develop it the way that it was. I still have some of the photos of grooming the lift ramps with big rips right through the photos that you'll notice. We took some more shots of grooming as I finished up my shift. This time, he rode in the heated cab, getting out to take a few shots occasionally. If I were to characterize him, I would have to say he's intrepid. I got to try snow sculpting on him and see what happens. Yeah, we're getting a little close here. I think maybe I should do something that my mother said that I should do. And I had kind of thought maybe, you know. But it's about snow, and it's a little bit of a departure because it's a song. Yesterday was the first day of spring. This morning we woke up completely snowed in. Snowing, snow blowing like crazy, it's nearly 2 feet. Forget that it's Monday, let's do something sweet. Electricity's off and the wood stove is low. I stoked it up some and it's starting to go. But it's warm here with you curled up next to me. We could stay here for however long it might be. We're snowed in, snowed in. The blizzard has got us cut off from the world. Snowed in, snowed in. A mini vacation for me and my girl. We'll have morning coffee right here in our nest. It's this part of winter that I like the best. Snowing and blowing and nothing to do but spend some more quality time here with you. Snowed in, snowed in. The blizzard has got us cut off from the world. Snowed in, snowed in. A mini vacation for me and my girl. We can stay here all day and we won't miss a thing. It's all been canceled or put off till spring. The jobs and commitments of our daily lives get put off for a day and nobody minds. Snowed in, snowed in. The blizzard has got us come off from the world. Snowed in, snowed in. A mini vacation for me and my girl. Thank you. Often when I go to write something, it comes out with rhymes and ends up as a song. Do you have anything more you'd like to impart?
Oh, I've got oodles always.
Well, we got a few minutes.
Okay, I'll use them all up. You want to join me?
Okay.
Hang on to that. Oh, you know what? I got one in here that I promised me I would read. All I have to do is find it.
It needs to be really short.
Huh?
It needs to be really short.
I know, I know. Yesterday I had a meeting of the Spinners Club at my house. We all met because we worked at Frontier Town about 20 years ago.
More.
All right, 30, how's that? Anyway, I was trying to think what I could tell all you people about the Adirondacks, and I asked them what they could do for me, and they were all from somewhere else. Because everybody is all from somewhere else, which is how we populate the Adirondacks. Well, we have to entertain you in the summer, and we get to languish all winter.
Okay, we're done.
I don't get to tell them anymore.
Well, she's got a few more things she says she wants to get done.
Is it time for you?
The college needs this room
Yep.
at 1 o'clock, I'm told. Sorry.
Oh, I was just getting started.
Maybe you'll help with the door prizes then.
Yeah.
Did everyone get a ticket in the door prize raffle? So I'm going to leave this basket here. Perhaps you'll pull the winners for us.
Do I get to do that?
Oh, yeah. We would love it if you would do that. What do we have up first? Okay, so we have pairs of tickets for storytellers at Proctor's for a number of events that are upcoming. So if you'll draw a winning ticket,